Jerry, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, Tom. Well, professionally, what I've done is be philosophy professor, University of Colorado Boulder, run a federal agency, National Endowment for the Humanities, and but more importantly for our purposes, I had a God experience, an encounter, which I think it's reasonable for me to take to be God, and felt directed in prayer to write a book about it. God, an autobiography. God, actually, in prayer, I received the title in prayer. It seemed to me kind of over the top. So I added, and they put it in very small letters here, as told to a philosopher, because we don't have God on tape. We've just got Jerry Martin's report of what he received, what came to him in his encounter with God. But my personal story, relevant to our topic, starts with being raised in a Baptist family. By the time I finished my freshman year of college, I was an agnostic, part of the experience, but it was a long waning elements of belief for various reasons. But you take philosophy and they march out all the arguments for the existence of God and they shoot them all down. But meanwhile, more important for me was the one thing I'd learned from the Baptist that I've retained to this day is the most important thing in life is the state of your soul. And that's what Plato and Aristotle and other great philosophers, Spinoza, Kant, and so forth, thought. And that's why Plato says this odd thing that no harm can come to a good man. And that's because the only vital harm is the harm you do to yourself, to your own soul. And he didn't mean you can't be wounded and have all these horrors inflicted on you. But the philosophers teach that. And so if you live your life according to the teaching of the wisest thinkers, then you can live a very high-minded life, deeply meaningful, full of purpose, and that's satisfying. And so I was perfectly satisfied agnostic. I had never had an interest in religion beyond that. Once I left that behind, found philosophical wisdom, I was set. And I had developed a kind of vague naturalistic philosophy, kind of what I believed was the world of experience as I then knew the world of experience. However, the one dissatisfaction I had was I'd been divorced for many years. And I always felt I'd be happier if I were happily married. We're well married, but Miss Right never came along. And as I was getting older, I thought, oh no, is this it? And then one day, I'm in my office working away. The phone rings. It's Abigail Rosenthal, Brooklyn College. It's Miss Wright calling me on the phone. I didn't, of course, know that yet, but she called. We got a problem at the college. Can you help? And I said, yes, that's what we do. We entered into something that became a major controversy covered in all the papers, in the New York area at least, and talked really daily because there was this going on. I would line up interviews, I would need documentation, I would need this, that, and the other thing for my helping role. And then she was doing her part, and we talk every day and for months. And I fell in love with her, sight unseen. When I went up to New York to give a talk about it after we won the controversy, to give a controversy about it, she came. That was the first time I laid eyes on her. Well, I thought I really lucked out. She's cute too. She could have been, mashed potatoes and drag, and I was already in love. So I don't know what would have happened then, but in fact, she was cute too. There were no obstacles, and I then courted her via Amtrak, and luckily she responded. I had never believed in love. In fact, when people, well, I guess I had what I thought of as a mature view. You know, you fall in love when you're young and immature, but later I thought I was looking for compatibility. I even had a like Myers-Briggs profile in mind. This is the kind of person who would match me. You know, enough same, enough difference, because you need some mix of those two in a good relationship or marriage. So that's what I was looking for, was kind of compatibility. And this was completely different from compatibility, from mere compatibility. If we were compatible, they were extremely different. So that didn't mean there's no friction, but uh, um, just so knock your socks off in love. And to me, this is like a metaphysical experience. You're seeing something deep about the nature of reality. That's how it came to me. And uh, and in the life, you know, the reason I sometimes say if I ever had any conversion, it wasn't to God, it was to love. And I say that in part, one of the things a conversion experience is supposed to do is to kind of transform your life. At least that's what the literature tells you, and a lot of human experience tells you. And my life was completely transformed. As I put it, it went from a collection of purposes to having a meaning. It went from a kind of black and white universe to technicolor. It went from two-dimensional to three-dimensional, as it turned out, in-dimensional. But in that experience, it had a depth dimension that had been absent before. And this was such an extraordinary blessing that I felt gratitude. I didn't know who to be grateful to, but I was an agnostic. I felt gratitude just because it seemed unearned, you might say. It came into my life. And so it had the characteristics of a gift or blessing. And since my feeling of gratitude was so very great, that it seemed right to express it. And I couldn't think of any reason I should not express a sincere, deep feeling about such a matter. So I literally fell to my knees, as I'd been taught as a child, and prayed to what I call the Lord. But I had no idea what the Lord meant. Is this Yahweh? Is this the Lord Jesus Christ? Is this Lord Krishna that the Hindus worship? Or is it just a benign universe? You know, the universe smiled on me that day. And I didn't worry about that, because what I was essentially doing is not forming a belief about the object of the prayer, the recipient of the prayer. I was expressing my own deep feeling that, wow, my life has been transformed here. So thank you, whomever or whatever. Thank you. Sometime later, I'm cutting the story a little short. It's told in the book. I should mention the book. Did I hold it up before?
Yes.
Yes, I held it up. If more is told in the book, of course, than we can mention here. The it's hard for me not to notice these these insults along the side, emotional hemophiliac or something. Okay. May you be well. This is my life that I'm recounting.
You can ignore the chat. That's just the people in the audience.
No, it's obviously interesting, which it's hard, but there it is, keep popping up and moving, but that's fine. And I understand all the skepticisms of the world. In fact, I found this such a remarkable experience that I went to read what do the experts say? What do the psychologists say? I think I've got something I pulled aside here. Oh yeah, you go read the books on relationships and so forth, because I thought, wow, I never knew about this phenomenon. I want to learn about love. So let's go read the experts, the psychologists, relationship psychologists, and so forth. And they all warn against projection. They warn against projection. Okay, we can make things up, we can project them. We all understand that's a phenomenon. Love is an illusion, they say. It'll snap in about 6 months. You think the person's perfect, and then they're not. No, I didn't think she was perfect. I'm not perfect. Had nothing to do with who is perfect. It was a different phenomenon that I encountered. And one of the most famous, I'll just quote it because I looked around. Karen Horney, very famous psychologist, wrote an article called The Problem of the Monogamous Ideal, which is based, she says, on the overestimation of love. The overestimation of love leads, she says, to disillusionment. Disillusionment plus the desire to escape plus non-fulfillment result in a secret hostility, which causes the other partner to feel alienated. Secret hostility in one, secret alienation in the other, causes the partners to secretly hate each other. Well, and I know someone else who's very big into this kind of literature and cognitive studies, evolutionary psychology, says there are stages, and the first stage of love is one that passes, and that was my stage, the stage of infatuation. And he said, I forget, he thinks that's gone by the 7th year or something, based on brain studies. And I thought, oh God, I'd hate to be your wife. We're in love. My wife and I have been married almost 20 years now, and I'm as in love as I was on day one. So anyway, I did not change my beliefs. It's just except about love, which I understood not as projection, but as an experiential encounter. Here's a reality that I have encountered in experience. And Horney, I guess, did not encounter it in experience, or she would have written something different, probably. But one day, Abigail loved me back, thank goodness. And one day we're sitting on the banks of the Potomac together. She's writing in her journal beside me. It's a kind of park-like area. You see it's a beautiful setting. You see the Washington Monument and Lincoln Memorial across the river. We're on the south side of the Potomac. And I pray without my beliefs having changed, but obviously feeling more comfortable somehow with the act of prayer. I prayed for guidance. How are we going to make one life together? She's a tenured professor in New York. I'm running an organization in Washington, D.C. We do not want a weekend affair. Our getting-togethers and weekends are very romantic, but I thought, no, we want more than this. We want to make a life together. And these marriages, some of them work out for people where they have jobs in distant cities. That's academics, because of tenure, it's all rigidified and structured, and you can't move around very easily. So they have these long-distance marriages, and maybe it works for them, but that's certainly not what we wanted. So anyway, I'm just praying, how are we going to make this work in a life, share a life together? And so I pray, and without, again, having recipient, without worrying about that, it's just, it's not that different from thinking, except I'm putting it into a prayer to whomever, whatever. But the next thing that happens is what in the old days I suppose they would have called a vision. And it was kind of like a hologram, a few feet in front of me, of a rising, sparkling, multicolored fountain. And I thought, well, wow, that is a kind of answer. It is a kind of answer. It just means, basically, don't worry, it'll work out. Something is at work here that is going to grow and flourish. And so I thought, well, that's that. So I'm kind of, taking that in. But then there was more. A voice spoke. And the voice, and I knew it wasn't me talking. So I said, who, in my mind, not out loud, who is this? Who is this? I am God. Well, I knew There were a lot of religions, and therefore, in a sense, this was an agnostic hearing these words, and hence a lot of religions. And so, again, drawing on my own tradition, my own childhood, I said, the God of Israel, I am the God of all. Well, that's itself, I think the answer could be explored, but as I saw it, my naturalistic worldview had just been disconfirmed. It's like we had a hypothesis and new data has come in, and the new data disconfirms the hypothesis. Now, I knew from history of science and philosophy of science and everything else that you can always reject the data and hold on to your theory. That happens all the time, and it's almost, as some philosophers explain, it's almost essential for a scientific research program to develop, that it can't just let itself be knocked off its pins by one, negative report. However, my own bias, as you can see already, had been toward experience. And our experience seems more real than our theories, I guess you'd say. And so it seemed better to adjust the theory to the experience than the other option, adjust the experience to the theory, maybe just by throwing it out. Well, being an epistemologist, within philosophy, I was professor of philosophy. My field was epistemology. And this seemed all very strange to me. And I wondered, and so I called, since I had never studied these religious topics, I called a friend of mine, very smart philosopher, who was teaching at a religious college, and I thought, I bet he could help me out here. I said, is there any literature, any philosophical literature, since they are concerned with the question of what is veridical perception, that's a key concept in epistemology, which perceptions can you count on? Oh, yes, he said, that's the problem of spiritual discernment. Well, I thought, oh, my problem has a name. So that's great. And there are things you can read, a long tradition, in fact, the most famous of which particular writing is St. Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuit, his spiritual exercises. And he addresses these questions with great care. And what I found, there was a weakness in that whole tradition from my point of view, which is that their number one criterion for is this really God is, does this God, might say, believe what I believe? So, they want to check. He's not saying anything that violates the Nicene Creed, is he? If God is telling you something opposite of that, then it's not God. I mean, the voice is saying something opposite of that. But if you read the Calvinists, no, if it says something different from Calvin, it's not God. Well, I thought that criterion is not of use. In fact, it would itself pose the question of spiritual discernment. How did you come up with the Nicene Creed? What's its basis? But the other things they said were very helpful. And the leading thing is something like, you look at the person, you examine the instrument, the receptor. If your Geiger counter is showing radiation in an environment in which, where there's just not any radiation here, then you're getting strange readings, maybe you're not sure. Well, the first thing you do is check the Geiger counter. And what they say is check the Geiger counter. And there are certain things, especially that are bad signs. And that is, you think, oh, God has spoke to me. I'm now Lord of the universe. I now get to boss everybody else around. I now have magical powers. Well, these are very bad signs.
Why are those any different than thinking you even spoke to the God of the universe? Because when you talk about instruments, when we use an instrument to measure something and you say, look at the instrument and see if it works, I can say I'm using a ruler to measure weight. And the ruler seems to be working great. It's great at measuring feet and inches and centimeters, millimeters, perfect. Does that mean it's okay to measure weight? Well, no. So even if the tool is working very successfully, it doesn't mean it necessarily applies to all contexts. And so I'm not seeing how having a vision of a God and then reflecting back on the person is any different than using a ruler to measure weight and then reflecting back on the ruler, and why we would conclude that having visions of God tell you that you are the supreme ruler of the universe is any different than thinking you had visions of the creator at all.
Well, it's different in the instrument, but we're not interested in whether that's different. That's not our topic. The question is, what reason do I have to believe this is God speaking to me? And what I'm not trying to persuade you, Tom, of anything. I'm just trying to say, see if you can persuade me that I'm being unreasonable, because it seems to me I'm being quite reasonable. And when I look at the literature, and the first problem, what is the instrument in interaction with the divine? For all the testimony, massive in the history of mankind, and certainly in my personal experience, the instrument is the human being. And it's not just the human being as somebody reads dials in a laboratory, but the whole human being, our whole capacities. And often these discussions are too narrow. I was going to mention one other thing after the spiritual discernment literature, the focusing on the instrument, that I found a more recent development than after I left campus, is virtue epistemology. And when I read it, Descartes worries about evil demons and stuff. What virtue epistemology says, look, the real problems of knowledge aren't evil demons, brains in vats, in this kind of extreme case. The real problems of knowledge are, again, a lot of them problems about the instrument. Are you being reasonable? Are you taking in everything anybody tells you? Or kind of thinking, well, I believe this and this is why, and I'm not just going to flip-flop, so are you being both open to evidence? It's always a kind of golden mean. Are you being both open to evidence and yet not just flip-floppy and, irresolute? And are you being careful in your investigations or careless in your investigations? Are you being too close-minded or too open-minded? And it's always a kind of golden mean. If you just stick to what you start off believing, and a lot of people do that because you can always mount arguments for whatever your initial belief system is, that may be too rigid. It may be too militant, too defensive. So you have to be open to disconfirmation. But without being so open that anything somebody else says or any little one fact, as I say, the research programs wouldn't work. Newton already had anomalies at the day his great work was published, and he knew that. So you haven't quite figured out everything, but you're trusting you will in a case like Newton. So anyway, I found the virtue epistemology was saying the same thing. Now you're right, Tom. If one focuses on instrument in too narrow a way, and I suggested an example that invites that narrow focus, Geiger counter, after all, but let's broaden it. There's some people whose judgment you trust. Maybe they're good at judging other people. You encounter someone and you think, yeah, I wouldn't buy a used car from this guy. Now that's a judgment by your whole person, not just a perceptual thing, judgment by your whole person. You might well ask a friend, because you might say, well, I'm pretty good at judging character, but I have a friend who just nails it, Well, you go to the friend, say, what do you think? Maybe if the friend persuades you, maybe the friend say, well, he seems okay to me, but well, you're not so sure. So, you keep that open. Most of our judgments, the life decision judgments, would I be happier moving to California? Well, those are, you can make a good judgment about it, but it's going to be, it's going to use all of your faculties, including your emotional faculties and your imaginative faculties. What will life really be like? I might have a picture postcard version, but if I try to think, well, is that what life would really be like? if I were in California or if I switched jobs. So, and our choice of philosophies, which is something I've been rather close to in my career, people choose philosophies for whole life reasons, that it fits or doesn't fit their life experience, their priorities, their own sense of reasonableness, their different philosophical theories of reason and logic and so forth. But it doesn't fit it may or this or that may or may not fit their own notion of what's reasonable or their own life experience or their own sense of what's most real. And people have often very strong convictions about those things. Sometimes they're rather open about them, and they live their life without a strong conviction about, well, what's most real, or one of these things that preoccupies philosophers. Go back to you, Tom. Am I being reasonable? But the virtue epistemology backs up the spiritual discernment literature, saying you check yourself out. Are you a reasonable person? Do I have my feet on the ground? I've had a pretty successful career, and I passed that test. You might say I'm almost boringly normal, unless you take my falling in love to be abnormal. But no, I don't believe that, and I don't think it's justified. In fact, I thought, have none of these psychologists been in love? I went and read a nice volume, a collection of essays of letters on love, and things written about love by great writers. And there I thought, who are the most actually perceptive students of human nature, human motivation, human behavior? It's the authors, it's the literary figures. This is what they are good at. And they believe in love. And from reading them, you can see love can also go wrong. There are moving letters written by Edith Wharton to a guy who, to an outsider's eyes, is obviously not worthy of her. But she's, captivated, you might say. Okay, there are those warning things as well. And that can happen in any form of experience, including political commitments or economic doctrines or anything you want to name. One can get carried away. So that's the virtue thing. Well, don't get carried away. Kind of be open to things, take them in. If they seem really true and important to you, whether you can prove them or not, you take them to heart. And that's a different way. It's just a question of how you want to live your life, in effect.
So it seems like you're saying that you look at the way you're functioning and think, if you're functioning fine, then anything you believe is justified. Is that?
No, I didn't say that, did I?
Well, I'm trying to understand your argument here, because it seems like you're saying that if, in general, the things you believe seem rational, then any possible belief you have that's significant to you, by extension, is justified.
No, I wouldn't say that. I didn't say it, and I wouldn't say it. Let's go back to that judge of character. Maybe very important whether I can trust this person.
Well, that's the part I'm not understanding, because I think that's irrelevant. I don't care at all what anybody's character is. Like, if somebody tells me they saw a magical unicorn, it doesn't make a difference to me if they're the crazy guy on the side of the corner, or if they're president of the United States, or, I don't know, Stephen Hawking. I'm not going to believe them. They have zero credibility, because no testimony can ever be sufficient evidence to believe a new ontology is the case, because we have defeaters for the human brain. So if you have a human brain, your testimony is not viable. What?
This is, we're really going off the rails here, Tom. I didn't say that if you're a sound person, everything that pops into your head is going to be valid. The spiritual discernment literature doesn't say that. They put in warnings about it. But we're just not saying that. But it's the first thing you check is, how do we know about the world? Why do I trust my reasoning? Well, because I seem like a reasonable person.
Wait, why is that the first thing you check? Because to me, that seems like a complete irrelevancy.
Well, it's irrelevant if you want to talk about unicorns, but it's not irrelevant if you're going to talk about how you decide whom to marry or what to trust or what job to take, where would you be happy?
Sure, I would agree.
Not relevant to any of these important, crucial life decisions. And ontology, I don't personally have, I'm more an epistemologist. I don't have a great sort of interest to figure out, you know, I mean, the whole history of philosophy, and I've taught it. You've got Plato's metaphysics, Aristotle's metaphysics, Spinoza, Kant, Hegel, and so forth. There are all these tremendous systems. I have never tried myself to work those out. If you, I felt you were, Tom, seemed to be making a default to just something vaguely like the currently popular scientific materialism. You know, our brains are everything. And well, that's a controversial view. You can't just start that as your premise. That's a controversial view. You look at, I like the title of a book by the great philosopher of science, Karl Popper, co-written by the, I think, Nobel Prize winner in neurology, Sir John Eccles, called My Mind and Its Brain. And that would be closer to my own sense of things, that it's we, you know, what does the thinking? Our minds do the thinking, the brain does the processing. But
well, that part's like a separate.
I don't have a developed view about that. I'm just saying the view you're announcing can't be a premise; it's a conclusion.
Well, I didn't bring in a conclusion. My only claim here is that we know human testimony is unreliable in cases of.
We do not know that, Tom.
No. Well,
we do not know that.
We know. So let me finish. Let me finish before you interrupt.
Yes, sorry.
We know human testimony is unreliable in claims of things that have not been empirically verified. So unicorns, leprechauns, mythical creatures, magic, the paranormal, supernatural, UFOs. Testimony is not accepted for any of those. Not in history, not in law, not in science, not in physics, biology, zero. So in cases of those class of things that have not been shown to exist independent of our imagination, testimony is worthless. Now, in the case of things that have been shown, like what makes you happy, is there a dog, did you see that guy murder that guy, all of those things, testimony is fine. But when it comes to new ontologies, any claims about those, testimony is insufficient to justify those, which is why every court case about UFOs or miracles or magic is immediately thrown out, because testimony is not sufficient to provide precedent that such a thing actually exists. You need more than that. And it seems like, why should we give a special exception to spiritual religious experience? And I understand that you're not trying to convince me. From the perspective of you, why would you give a special exception to this case when I imagine you would probably treat UFOs in the same way and probably not take them seriously in a courtroom? But your spiritual experience, why treat that differently?
Well, what has struck me as an epistemologist is that there are different domains of experience, reasoning, you might call reality, although, as I say, I don't try to develop a big ontology of these things. But, you know, if you're going to talk about what's real, I kind of think, you know, poetics is a form of inquiry. And it has its own methods, its own results, and it's coming up with real results. Historical geology, they don't run experiments, they have data, and the data, they form hypotheses, but they have a rather different character. What the historian does in giving an interpretation of the Civil War brings in many things beyond the kind of laboratory data that people tend to take as, you might say, the one and only model. But it's not the one and only model. There's nothing wrong with historical interpretation. Why did Lincoln do that? And we're trying to figure out why he held off on the Emancipation Proclamation. We're coming up with a reasonable interpretation of it. Here we're doing something a little more like what the novelists do when they talk about the human dynamics. And there's a world, you know, once you open up, but there are different domains of experience, and there are different kinds of things people can experience. People can experience other people's character. They can have intuitions of right and wrong. They can go into the death camps and say, oh my gosh, this is horrible. And they don't have to necessarily have a theory for that. It just registers on them. We do have a kind of some capacities. People like to call it intuition sometimes, but we have some capacities to register things and to take them in as what we're registering as some reality that's
Well,
registered
so
on us.
I understand that, but we know that fails so often. Every single fallacy, bias, illusion, delusion, misconception, confirmation bias, anchoring bias, type 1 and type 2 errors. We have tens of thousands of instances of that specific thing you're talking about completely provably failing. And so we haven't prove it failed in every case, because some people have intuitions of unfalsifiable things. But in those cases, should we take that seriously, or should we say, oh, this is probably one of those tens of thousands of proven fallacies, biases, illusions, delusions, that this does not work?
Well, it's it's reasonable to take it seriously. Uh,
Wait, why? Because
if,
if we I'm
if it
not
makes
following.
if it makes sense, not of the one set of criteria you're advancing, Tom, but if it makes sense of a lot of things in life. We're whole human beings. We're mind, body, soul. We're emotions. We're bearers of ideals and aspirations. So the question in accepting a view is, how does it mesh against the whole range of factors going on? And
Well, to me, that seems problematic.
the big
So, like,
problem.
well, to me, it seems like you're saying, here is a compass we know is broken, but if the direction it's pointing now really makes sense of some other things, then it might be right this time. And to me, that's like, it's a broken compass. We should not use the broken compass. Saying that it makes sense to you now is not helpful here.
That's not established, Tom. I mean, I know these people, and I know human beings are fallible. That's a well-known fact, and no, certainly my experience doesn't deny that. I'm fallible too, right? I know I'm fallible. That doesn't mean it's unreasonable for me to believe a reality that I encounter. I mean, if I don't believe in things like, I don't know, Bigfoot, but probably if I saw Bigfoot, I would adjust my openness to that belief. One useful epistemological concept is what are a person's plausibility conditions? Now, I gather you have said, well, I guess for you and me both, Bigfoot is probably kind of outside our plausibility conditions. And I often, if I'm giving this kind of talk about my experience, a question would be, I said it'll be more meaningful to you, but it's everybody's option. Your plausibility conditions can include the possibility that there's a God or not. They can include, if you are open to the possibility that there's a God, are you open to the possibility that God can communicate? Because some understandings of God would not allow that. And if you're open to that, are you open to the idea that here in the 21st century, God could communicate with somebody like Jerry Martin? And again, there are people, some, what is the religious statement used in the Christian tradition used to be, or maybe Jewish tradition used to be, the age of prophecy is over. In other words, God talked up to the end of the book of Revelations and then clammed up, basically. But so there's a third plausibility condition. And
So I agree those are possible. I'm in the those are possible camp, but I think it's improbable. So why? I'm not following, like, why that would be relevant here. So I agree those are possible. There's no logical contradiction there.
So if you had my experience, you're a sane person, you have unusual blessings in your life that perhaps lead to a kind of openness in this direction. And maybe you'd see that as a failing. I don't want to put words in your mouth. Would you, I mean, you might just go to the psychiatrist and let them say, oh no, or check, maybe it's a brain disorder. You've got an aneurysm or something. I don't know. What would you do? What would you do?
Well, I'd say I already have an explanation for this. It's one of the 10,000 fallacies and biases that have been proven to exist irrefutably. And this can already be explained by the data. So if I already have a thing that we know exists, which fully explains the data, why would I posit a new ontology that is less simple, less epistemically sound, less explanatory power?
Well, you're in the throw out the data side then. You've
Well,
got
no,
to,
I'm not throwing out the data. There's already something that explains the data. The data has been explained by an already existing hypothesis.
how if we, if this happened to you, what would have explained the data? God,
Epilepsy, seizure, cocaine.
you have those things?
Well, I have a brain. I have this thing called a human brain, and the human brain does this.
All you have?
What?
Aren't you a living, moving human being? Aren't you having perceptions, reactions, understandings, interpretations?
Well, yes, but all of that is irrelevant because the only thing I need to explain the data is a brain. If I have a brain and the brain has neurons and the neurons fire erratically and they can cause disproportionate feelings in certain sectors because of different functions like epilepsy, like temporary seizures, because literally all brains do that, then the fact that I have an experience of an all-powerful being is fully explained by our already known neurology of the fact of what the brain does. I don't need to posit another thing to explain that.
um, to me, it's to my ear. I mean, that just sounds kind of like a circular argument. The brain explains everything. Therefore, with this thing we don't know how to explain, we just trust it explains everything. And how on earth do we know that the brain explains everything?
Well, I never said the brain explains everything. I said the brain explains that. So any particular phenomenon like seeing God, talking to God, profound experiences, we have a plurality of examples of this throughout cultures, throughout people in the world, and we can look at their brains through fMRIs and we can see, oh, these areas light up when people have these experiences, and people who have certain kinds of conditions that don't light up those areas as much see God less often, and people who have conditions that light up those areas significantly more often, like epilepsy, see God a lot more often. And so we can make a direct correlation to this part of the brain, when it's activated, will cause these sensations that we see. Has novel testable predictions. We can correlate it to data we have to see it's more prevalent in people who have this and less prevalent in people who don't. And we can say that if we stimulate these areas, we can cause you to repeat those same sensations by electrocuting you, and say, because of this data we have, the experiences of a supernatural being are significantly more reasonably explained by this data that we can test and make predictions of and be confirmed correct and show that it has a predictive power to be able to explain probabilities of which groups will and will not have these experiences. This seems like a much more rational explanation of the data.
Well, rational if you make a whole bunch of assumptions, only against a huge background of controversial assumptions.
Why do I need assumptions there? Because I don't assume God doesn't exist. I don't assume the mind is only physical. I don't need to assume any of those things. All I need to say is that this hypothesis explains the data better, that this part of the brain caused that function. Now, if that was wrong and it was actually a God, then we wouldn't necessarily expect a particular part of the brain to be associated with this experience. And so this data is expected under the hypothesis, this part of the brain causes the phenomenon. It is not expected under the hypothesis the experience is caused by a God or whatever. And so this data explains this hypothesis explains the data better, even if I don't assume there's no God.
Right, you're assuming there. It's kind of a priori that. So if it happened to you, Tom, you would say my brain is malfunctioning.
Well, no, because it's working as it was designed. I think evolution has designed the brain to do this. So I wouldn't say it's malfunctioning.
Okay, but you'd say, I can't believe this because I've studied evolutionary theory, and I know this is a natural bias of evolution that evolution produces.
Yes, I would say it would be irrational to believe it corresponds to reality, and I think it would be more rational to believe it is a product of a evolutionarily designed brain.
Uh-huh. So that if evolutionary theory develops in a way that goes in a different direction, then you would be open.
Sure, if there was contradicting data that evolution did not produce this phenomenon or something, or wouldn't produce this phenomenon, then that would be evidence against that hypothesis.
Well, that it's not clear there is evidence for that hypothesis, actually. That's more a postulation. You know, if you want to believe, if you want to disbelieve religious experience, you can go back and look at the evolutionary record and hypothesize. It's really just a hypothesis that, oh, it must have helped survival, because something like animism, where it's a high risk if it's a real tiger and you don't believe it's a tiger, therefore, as I take it, this is the evolutionary argument on these grounds. Therefore, we're kind of hardwired to immediately react to things as if they had intentional, that's purposes behind it. At least that's one line of thinking.
Well, I'm
That's
kind
just
of lost.
this.
Well, so I don't even need to make the evolutionary assumption here. I can just say we can just assume we were created 5 minutes ago by leprechauns. I can do the tests on the brain to show that this part of the brain correlates to these experiences at a higher rate than chance. And we would not expect that if there was a God who caused these experiences. We would expect that if those experiences were caused by the brain. Now, regardless of whether or not we evolved, doesn't make a difference here. The data of just looking at the brain says this is the better conclusion.
So the brain is the key. So and you would look at your brain.
Yes.
Or you would assume something's going on with your brain. I mean, you moved to the evolutionary when I asked, what would you do? And you would think you're mistaken because of the evolutionary story. Now you're saying, I just don't quite understand. You would have advised me to go look at my brain. You would go look at your brain. You would go ask someone what? About your brain. What would you want to know about your brain?
Well, if my goal here is to try to determine if the experience was veridical and corresponded to reality, I would try to apply a method to differentiate, is this imaginary or is it real? Now, my a priori before addressing the argument, I would have my background data that I know there's tens of thousands of fallacies and biases that have been proven scientifically. We know these exist that can already explain this. And so I already have a weight that's probably the better explanation. But if I wanted to prove that wrong, what I would need is some kind of novel testable predictions that says, if this was experience of a God and not just one of those fallacies or biases, I need to be able to make a prediction of, if God exists, the kind I experience here is something in the future I would expect to see, and do a test to see if I could experience that future experience. And if I did, then that would be confirmatory evidence of my experience was in fact from God.
Yeah. So you would have approached it by holding on to the theory and rejecting what I call the data. In other words, you say this experience, God is talking to me, but that can't be real. Is that what you're saying? That's what you would say in your own case?
Well, I'd say, so the data is, I had an experience where I think God talks to me. That's the data. And then the explanations, the possible hypotheses are, God actually spoke to me, or it was a phenomenon of brain states that is known from all of these fallacies or biases. Those are the two main hypotheses here. And I'd then, based off of those hypotheses, I'd make testable predictions about what I would most likely see. If this was a product of one of those fallacies, then I'd expect the parts of my brain that light up would be the same parts of the brain that the epileptics light up. And I would go into an fMRI and I test to see if that's the case. And if I said, if this was a product of God, what I would expect is that I would be able to make novel predictions about the future. If God, say, is the Christian God, when I die, I'll see him in heaven. That's a testable prediction. If that happens, that's good evidence for me to believe I did in fact speak to God. And so I would look for confirmatory evidence of both hypotheses and see which ones I could verify to see which is more plausible.
Would you actually have a procedure? I mean, have them check whether the epilepsy parts of the brain were lighting up?
Yes.
Okay, ideally.
Well,
I mean, it might be
it
feasible.
wouldn't be a procedure. It's just fMRI. You go into a brain scan. It's not like they dig into your brain.
You're not going to go check it in the brain.
Well,
just
so an fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, is the big magnet thing they put. It's not they don't have to like actually open your head.
Or lighting up. Okay,
Yeah.
so you'd go get that and see. You'd expect the epilepsy parts are going to light up, and if in Gandhi's experiences, the epilepsy part might have been lighting up. You know, you always talk as if none of these had any validity, but there are untold histories. In most of human history, most people believed in God. I found, reading an account of Kenneth Cracknell, a Christian missionary who early in his career went to Western Africa to bring light into darkness, and said, oh, these people already knew about God. And in fact, they knew a great deal about God. And they he would have learned more from them had he been a little more flexible. He was holding on to his theory. I mean, he went there as a missionary. That was his job. But in fact,
Wait, well, I'm not quite following.
So there are these experiences. So given the range of human experiences on moral questions, aesthetic questions, what's beautiful, what's fitting, what's unfitting, what's issues of practical judgment, when to speak and when to be quiet, things like that. The range of human knowledge is enormous, and I don't see why all of those areas would be suspect unless you can do something with the brain or match them to experimental data. That's just not how they work. There are other domains of knowledge. That is not how they work. So it's as though you're trying to put them all through one grid here that you personally find very comfortable, but to me, it's uncomfortable, and it was even before my God experience, that it leaves out huge domains of reality, because the different ways of investigating reality are the avenues into these different domains. And they include some that are very sensitive and intuitive and hard to nail down even. It's hard to know whether a given interpretation of Dante is confirmed or disconfirmed. That's not even natural language in that domain. Is it insightful? That it would be more relevant to the question. So we have different approaches. When I take in the experience, and I think a person is well advised to be open to a wide range of experience and a wide range of types of inquiry, of avenues into reality. And there are things outside my plausibility conditions, like Bigfoot and so forth. We all have those, because you can't just march through life wide open. That's part of what virtue epistemology tells us. No, you need a belief system to navigate the world. And it's almost like the policies you adopt help you navigate the world and satisfy yourself. I say mind, body, and soul, but it's number one, we're talking about satisfying yourself intellectually.
Well, I think that's the question here is accepting these other forms of inquiry rational? I would say no. Like I could have a magic 8-ball and say I trust the magic 8-ball, so every time I shake it, I believe it. But if we know that the magic 8-ball gets the answer wrong most of the time, then it's irrational to believe the 8-ball. And so my assessment of what you're doing, I would have to say, when you accept these alternative methods, have these alternative methods ever been successful in a way that we could verify versus the very successful methods like science? And if they haven't, if they've been wrong most of the time, like a magic 8-ball, then it's irrational to trust them, just like it's irrational to trust a magic 8-ball. And I think that's the case.
No, well, I mean, this is just, to my mind, would be a bizarre move if I were to think, oh, this is like a magic 8-ball. And so is literary interpretation and historical interpretation and ethical intuition and aesthetic judgment, because none of them are verifiable.
Wait, so lots of those are verifiable. So like,
yes, most of, there were logical positivists for a while, said nothing is meaningful unless it's verifiable. Then they got disturbed because there's a lot in physics that is not verifiable. It's not quite clear what the law of conservation of matter and energy, how would you verify it or disconfirm it? It's more like an assumption of that regulates the whole enterprise. Well, okay, that's a different role, and you can explain that. But to my mind, it's very narrow to think, quote, verification, empirical verification, in this, my mind, narrow sense in which you're using it. I don't think of aesthetic judgment as non-empirical, but you do.
I didn't say anything about empirical here.
Well, all these other things, including religious experience, it works each one works by its own rules, and the reasonableness.
Well, the worked part is here, the part that I need to show. Like I know of zero religious experience that has ever given us any relevant knowledge in reality at all. To me, it seems like dowsing. We've proven dowsing wrong. Homeopathy. We've proven homeopathy wrong. Astrology. We've proven astrology wrong. A lot of people have these same religious intuitions about these things. And it seems like their religious intuitions are no different from the religious intuitions of religious individuals. And so why would we treat the religious intuitions any differently than we do homeopathy, astrology, phrenology, the fact that you have this intuition and you're saying there's this alternative methodology that we can use, I don't see your alternative methodology being any more reliable than homeopathy. How do we get to the point that yours is more reliable than homeopathy?
Well, it's different areas of knowledge have different measures, tests. They aren't, your verifiability somehow sounds as if it promises a definitive answer. That's a radical simplification.
Well, I'm not telling you to use verification. I'm asking you, how do you justify your alternative methodology? You don't need to say, don't use mine. I don't care about that. I want you to give me a reason why we should trust this.
Well, this is actually my personal reason. As I say, I think a lot matters what your own experience. I never feel I can talk anybody into belief in God or anything like that. I can explain why I take it as reasonable for me to believe this experience. And the crucial thing really is, it's like if there are non-cognitivists in ethics, as you know, and
Yes.
they say it's all boo-rah, Hitler's bad means boo Hitler. But you go into a concentration camp, you perceive. It's almost like a perception. And you can call it what you want, intuition, judgment, our language isn't super good here. But you perceive, this is terrible. This should never have happened. This is an outrage. And it's a moral outrage. It's a violation of everything deep and high and important. And well, there are lots of moral outrages, and a lot of them aren't so valid as this particular outrage. So the fact that there are a lot of errors, I was a logic professor, and all you do is teach fallacies. And you notice a lot of the fallacies are there because they're very persuasive, and that, in fact, at the
All of
beginning,
them.
yeah, they're all kind of persuasive, aren't they?
That's why they're fallacies, is that I would think evolution designed us to make these shortcuts that are false.
That's why we decide they're fallacies, that they're not related to the actual, in the right way, to the actual truth of what they're offered in support of.
Yeah.
But I'm not engaged in fallacies. And since I don't subscribe to what sounds to me like a narrow view of verification and even what can count, I read a lot of history.
Well, again, you're deferring onto my epistemology, but you haven't presented yours. Why are you treating your?
Yeah, you're right.
So the question here is, why are you treating your? One sec. So why are you treating your personal experience as more reliable than homeopathy, Bigfoot, UFOs? What is the difference?
Well, I'm just not interested in though. You always bring up these things as if they were highly relevant, unicorns and whatever. We're not talking about those.
Well, wait. So some of our intuitions are wrong, such as Bigfoot, unicorns, leprechauns, but you're taking your intuitions and saying yours are different.
I don't even know if those are intuitions. I don't know what they are. Did those people see Bigfoot and they were mistaken?
Yes.
I don't know anyone believes in unicorns, so those are just, I think there's a term in the logic textbook for that, red herrings.
Wait. So you had a personal experience where you think you saw God. They had a personal experience where they think they saw Bigfoot or UFOs or unicorns. Yes, there are testimonies of unicorns. I'm asking, why is your personal experience of God more reliable, or why should we take it more seriously than their testimony of UFOs?
Well, I haven't had their experience. That's number one. If I saw Bigfoot, I might have a different view. I think, oh, wow, maybe there is a Bigfoot. Or
you don't trust Bigfoot exists because of their experience, right? Them telling you they saw Bigfoot, that's not rational.
I've got zero interest in Bigfoot.
Right. Well, I don't. They do. They are telling you they saw Bigfoot.
I don't know why they're relevant to what I do with my experience. I encounter a reality.
I'll get you there. But so I'll get us there. I'll walk us there little by little. They tell you they saw Bigfoot. You think it's irrational to believe them, right?
I don't think. I'm a natural agnostic, meaning, in spite of conditions, plausibility conditions, they're more like plausibility biases. And if somebody tells me they saw Bigfoot, then I'd think, that's interesting. And Bigfoot's, and then there are all kinds of questions one would ask, but I'm a little more open in that way. And I'm not quite sure what I would think was absolutely impossible. But anyway,
so let me ask a different way. Would I be rational to say, nope, you had a delusion, one of the tens of thousands of delusions lots and lots of people have that explain this data, and you were mistaken, it was probably a bear? Would I be rational to think that?
well, I think you're being narrow and arbitrary, but that's not quite
Wait,
the same.
how is that narrow and arbitrary? How is using all of the empirical data we have, which has been proven, arbitrary?
It's completely insensitive.
Well, sure, it's insensitive, but it's not arbitrary.
It's completely insensitive to the vast array of modes of inquiry, all of which are reasonable, that result in insights and illuminations and deep meanings, and how to interpret Dante is one of them, and how to understand Shakespeare, and how to understand Lincoln's motivations, and what was the American founding really about. These are all, and they're not unreasonable investigations. They have their own methods, hermeneutic methods and so forth. And I'm always struck, just as one goes through life. I don't know why you don't quite take these into account, but anyway, I do, that we have perceptions. We make practical judgments. We make aesthetic judgments. The aesthetics judgments, you can be wrong. They don't have a strong methodology, but they don't float in a vacuum either. You can say reasonable things about why you think this is a beautiful painting or a beautifully designed building. And they're just all of these different modes of awareness. And it's the reality itself, in my view, that is confronting you with its meaning, its beauty, its intricacies, its richness. To me, those are part of the range of human experience. And
so I understand that part. I understand that part. So, but when people do homeopathy, they think the exact same thing. When people do dowsing, they think the exact same thing. The realities of the energies of water are telling them where the water is. The realities of the memory of water is empowering you with the water source stuff in homeopathy. The psychic energies from astrology are telling you about reality when people do astrology. Why are your cases where you think these things directly tell you about reality are any different from all of the cases we know they're wrong, where they think they have these intuitions that tell them directly about reality, and we just prove them wrong in 5 seconds? But yours we can't prove wrong because they're unfalsifiable. What is the difference? Why should we take yours seriously just because it's unfalsifiable?
You have a great interest in all those cases, and I guess because we can sometimes be wrong. I mean, I know from the beginning that human beings are fallible and I'm fallible, that nothing could be more obvious, and that there'd be nothing easier to be mistaken about. Nevertheless, you confront a reality. I think your obligation, this is a basic question of epistemology. What happens in experience? In my own view, of course, I thought this through in this way only after I had the experience, but in my own view, reality presents itself. And usually you don't have to wait for scientific studies or to check your brain. You fall down the stairs, you fell down the stairs, you know something about the stairs. And my view is it's not that different. Well, you trusted someone and then you wondered whether you should, and then you made a wrong judgment. And so you correct that judgment. Well, you can't do that in a lab, but life is full of knowledge of all kinds, and their encounters. My own basic view is we encounter reality, and after you encounter it, then you have to sort it out. And I saw no reason to discount this one. You discount the entire category. Of course, that if this happened to you, that would make this an easy decision for you. For me, it was a hard decision. And that's why I investigated spiritual discernment, virtue epistemology, had to think through, is this reasonable for me to believe this? It was a compelling reality, as compelling as I felt it was if somebody hit my head in the dark. I think somebody must have, it's as compelling as that, and deeply meaningful. So it's like falling in love. If I could poo-poo love like all these other people. I mean, how many times do people have false loves? False loves must be rarer than true loves. I don't know. Probably false insights of great philosophy are maybe more common than the true ins than the best insights, and so on. The aesthetic judgments. Maybe most aesthetic judgments are horrible. That doesn't mean
so
they're responding to reality.
I'm a
And
moral realist. I believe in objective morality. I think love, purpose, meaning, they can all be objective. That's fine. But my question here is,
well,
how do, like, if I was homeopathy, if I had a profound experience of homeopathy or astrology that was meaningful to me, and I thought I was getting a direct experience of reality, if I'm using your epistemology, it sounds like, even though I already know homeopathy and astrology have been disproven in science, I should still believe it. I should still be rational to believe my personal experience because I had the experience. And it would be taking my approach, where I'd say I would be irrational to believe that I should probably test it more, and I'd only be rational after I tried to show it in some eternal way. That is some unreasonable epistemology that I'm somehow biased and not, and this is not something we should do. Like, this doesn't make sense to me. So again, my question is if I had a profound experience of homeopathy that I thought was a direct experience of reality, had a profound impact on my life, would I be rational to believe it, even already knowing that science says it's false?
well, I have no view about these things, and I wouldn't. I just don't know they've been proved wrong, and I have no interest in them. If they were true, I mean, great for somebody. But my question is, if I encounter a divine reality, am I just to disregard that? I mean, that's the question I faced. I know it could be wrong, but what if it's not wrong? What if it's not wrong? And I thought, if I trust this is a divine voice, I had my own little wager, you might say, that I had to go through. If I trust that this is a divine voice, and I had been sort of following it, but nothing was really at stake, but I continued to follow it, write a book, very embarrassing, told the world, and I thought all my friends are going to say, did you hear what happened to Jerry Martin? He thinks God talks to him. I thought I'd built a great career in Washington. I thought, that's going to go tumbling down now, lose all my friends. But what if the voice is God? And there's something God wants, the real God wants me to do. And now I don't do it. Well, to me, that was an unacceptable consequence. The first was acceptable. Kind of spoil a career. A lot of people who pursue maybe they're great artists and they leave a good job in advertising and pursue it. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. But they make that kind of, you come to it. Which mistake can I live with? And I could live with that mistake. I could not live with it being the real God, and I'm going to turn my back on it.
I don't, like, that seems like Pascal's wager, but that seems irrelevant to the epistemology question. Is it rational to believe?
Right.
Appeal to consequences wouldn't have any relevance to the epistemical rationality of it.
Yeah, you're right. That's a reason for my following it, not a reason for believing it. I believe it because I encountered a reality and did not see any reason it not to be a reality. And a bunch of analogies to people who believe wrong things simply is irrelevant to that, as just as people mistakenly falling and thinking they're in love is irrelevant to my experience of love. Or if I find this, if I see a beautiful work of art and judge it to be beautiful, it presents itself. This is my mode of experience. This is reality that presents itself to me. Well, the next person might get it wrong totally from my point of view, might think a whole bunch of ugly things are beautiful. That's irrelevant. That's irrelevant. And we live experience basically by letting reality speak to us. That's how perception works. You have the experience, you have the perception, you trust it, then you check it out. It could go wrong this way, that way, the other way. But I wouldn't say you throw it out altogether. I guess Bishop Berkeley, some subjective idealists, throw it out altogether. No, I would not do that. But you do check it out. And every reality that presents itself to you, you then check it out. But the criteria are drawn from that kind of phenomenon itself. If you're doing wine tasting, the criteria are drawn from wine tasting. They aren't drawn from physics or brain studies or something else.
Well, so like, if someone had an experience and they believed it's a direct reality, should they believe it every time?
Oh, who knows? I can't. How would I answer that? I do pray in an ongoing way. I follow my guidance in prayer. 100%. I know I'm not someone who the voice says jump off the cliff is going to jump off the cliff, but uh, and who I mean, I've never had to formulate it as a general rule. I pray each time. Sometimes, if I doubt something, I know this sounds very odd. Talk about being circular. I pray again later, see if I get the same thing. And I do find part of, as I say, this kind of experience has its own internal rules, as every method of inquiry does, like wine testing or anything you want to say, historical interpretation. It has its own rules. I find I have to I have to step back from my own desires, something like what the Bhagavad Gita teaches. I have to step back from my own desires. If I'm thinking, oh Lord, please don't tell me to do X, I want to do Y. I can't pray very well to get guidance. I mainly pray for guidance, thanks still, and guidance. And but I generally, once I am completely willing to do whichever the God voice tells me, then a clear answer comes through, and I decide how to act on that. But I never, well, anyway, it's reasonable. As I say, I wouldn't jump off a bridge because a voice says to jump off a bridge. This literature in spiritual discernment confirms that. The literature in virtue epistemology confirms it. It's all their judgment is almost the essential epistemic virtue, that you have to judge what is relevant in this situation. That's why I'm sensitive to different modes of inquiry. What is relevant to this mode of inquiry? What are the standards here? And that's closely related, as Aristotle has explained very early, to the nature of the subject matter. You have different standards, criteria of rationality and ethics than you do in physics, he explains. And in fact, you have less precision in ethics than you have in physics. And ethics is mainly a matter of training your moral habits, your virtues, and practical judgment in situations. It's highly situational what you should do to this person, to that person in this situation. And so you have to really tune into those things. But anyway, Tom, I think we've had a useful discussion. I think it's clearer where you and I disagree, and you take your stand. Well, you can say it for yourself, but the way I'm hearing it, on the most verified bodies of knowledge as you understand them. And I take my stand on the plurality of modes of inquiry, which I see as plurality of aspects of reality. And if you have that epistemology, then that there's a domain over here that's like religion or spirituality or something is less shocking. You're more open to it than if one starts from a different point of view.
Yeah, I would just say that in some cases, people have these intuitions and we know they're wrong. They're wrong 99% of the time, provably wrong 99% of the time. And if your intuition falls into that class of things that have been proven wrong definitively, then you should immediately say, I should not believe this. This is something that we know is bad. It's been proven as bad in every human brain we've ever tested, and it's never been successfully verified. And so if I have one of these kinds of intuitions, I should immediately be skeptical. That is the only rational position, is to immediately be skeptical until you find some other basis of evidence other than this faulty intuition basis to justify belief. And that would be my position.
Yes. And there again, a premise I disagree with, but again, we've litigated this already, is has religious experience been disproved massively? And that would be a longer discussion. You have to figure out what counts as proof, and so on. And what are the experiences of, and anyway, that's an assumption on your side. Again, I would not share any more than I would ethical or aesthetic, any of these other domains.
Yep. But yeah, we then have to start talking about prayer studies and NDEs and that kind of stuff, which would definitely be an interesting conversation for next time. But we have been going for a little over an hour. It was a great conversation. Really appreciate you coming on. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find out more about your work?
Oh, thank you, Tom. Very good of you. Be well.
Well, do you want to hold up your book again? People can find it. Tell people where to find you. Links.
I meant to hold up the book again. I don't know if we can get that in again. But anyway, it can be highlighted on the website or whatever.
Yeah. And I put your podcast link in the description for anybody who wants to find it. You asked me to do that.
That's great. The podcast was fun. It's not the whole book, but they can listen to a kind of dramatic adaptation of it with me talking to God, you might say. Whoa. And that'll help clarify which side of this debate they would come out on.
For sure. Thanks again. Really appreciate you coming on, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Okay, you too.
Bye-bye.